Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. The whole world has been shocked by the devastating images of the Trump administration's policy of separating migrant children from their parents at the border. The policy impacts Mexico as families try to unite along the entire migratory route from Central America through Mexico to the United States. To talk about this important issue, we're very happy to have with us today Molly Goss. Molly, thanks for being with us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Thank you so much for having me.
Molly is the case manager of the Transnational Families Program of the Institute for Women in Migration here in Mexico City. Molly, family separation has been going on since before this policy was announced formally by Jeff Sessions in April of this year. How do you think it's changed now? Do you see the situation worse than it has been before?
That's a great question. So it's true. Family separation is nothing new. I think what we've seen is an exacerbation of really strict policies that we've had for some time. I would say that at least the last 10 years, there have been separation of families, in particular Mexican families and Central American families at the border, but at the border and actually in the interior of the United States as well. So there's been a little bit of a difference in where the separations are taking place, but there still have been many separations, both in the interior and at the border. I think Trump's policy has really brought it to the fore. It's really brought it to everyone's kind of mind, not only in the US and Mexico, but in the entire world. But it's actually an issue that at IMUMI we've been working on for many years.
IMUMI being the Institute for
Right.
Women in Migration,
Yes.
by its initials in Spanish. Well, the fact that this has come to light, are there advantages in that, do you think?
I think there are advantages in it in the sense that we can talk more about family separation and the fact that it's existed for a long time. I think people that work in immigration attorneys and immigration advocates like myself and other people at the Institute for Women in Migration see it as a horrific thing. At the same time, we do see it as a possibility to bring people's attention to this issue. And again, to let them know that this has been happening in a really awful way recently, in a really brutal way, but it actually has been happening for years. And we can talk about a little bit how it happens in the interior, which is that women and men, particularly we work with female population mostly.
This is in the United States.
In the United States. Are often deported or have some kind of voluntary departure and have to leave their children in the U.S. And often because of not knowing what the local laws are, as we know in the U.S. there's 50 states and there's 50 different set of laws for each state, 50 different. And actually, even in the counties, there can be different policies about civil and family law. So basically, they get deported or they take a voluntary departure, and they don't realize they have to do something as simple as speaking with Child Protective Services and making sure that they talk to their children's social worker so that they...
And nobody tells them.
No. Not only does that occur, but I mean, there's all sorts of things they could be told about immigration law. I mean, a lot of these women could actually qualify for U visas, which is a visa for victims of crime in the United States. And something we've come across a lot in the Institute for Women in Migration is that these women qualify for either VAWA or U visas, perhaps some other kind of immigration benefit, and they get deported very quickly, or perhaps their attorney doesn't give them the right information, or perhaps they want to get out of detention as fast as they can because it is a very awful, heinous experience to be in immigration detention. And so not only do they not have the information about their children and their rights for their over their children or with their children, but they also have, there's a huge kind of girth of information about what they could do to stay in the country with their children. So it's a huge issue that I think, again, has been brought to light by this awful policy. But again, it's possibly one positive thing we can take out of it, it's hard to even say that because what positive thing can be taken out of it, but is that people will realize that this is actually something that's been happening for quite some time.
Yeah, so much trauma.
Yes.
But in the sense that there has been a lot of outrage. In Mexico, of course, there have been demonstrations in front of the U.S. Embassy. There are demonstrations in the United States, and actually you've seen demonstrations around the world about this. However, the Trump administration seems to be fairly impervious to that kind of outrage. Do you expect that there'll be any movement in terms of this policy? We saw a rollback in terms of like immediate separation, but there's still hundreds of families without their children.
Sure. There's even, just to add on to that we've seen numbers that there's more than 400 people who've been deported. So their children are in the U.S. and they are in their home country completely, thousands of miles away from their children. In terms of the June 30th marches that we saw, there, as you mentioned, there was one here in Mexico City, there was some all over the world. I mean, I think that it forms part of a couple of different things that needs to happen. I think that people organizing at the grassroots is very important. Trump did have to go back a little bit on the executive order, except I'm going to have to mention he signed that executive order to stop something that he put into place. So there's not a lot of there's no credit that can be given there at all. But I think it's important for the grassroots to keep mobilizing. I don't think it's the only part of the equation that's important to kind of stop this family separation that's happening at the border and the broader thing of family separation happening within the interior. I think that there are so many different components to it. One would be the grassroots organizing. Another would be kind of actually educating representatives and senators in the U.S. about this issue. I think it was Senator Dianne Feinstein that talked about the fact that she hadn't even really been aware of the fact that these kind of separations were happening until now, and she admitted her ignorance on that, and she's been in the Senate for quite some time. Yeah. So,
and in the state of California.
And in the state of California, which has a huge immigrant population, if not the largest in the country. So I think that not only must the grassroots organize, but I think that at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, we need to be educating and also getting rid of representatives, voting out representatives who are not taking this issue seriously, because it's a huge humanitarian issue and it needs to be at the forefront.
Yeah, the images have been so sad to hear children crying, and I think anyone can remember, like, even just being separated from your family for a night or something, how dramatically that gets engraved on a childhood. Well, let's talk about the human experience there. You work with cases all the time. Do you see some common characteristics?
So the family separation cases that we work on, since we're so far from the border, we're in Mexico City, are mostly these cases I mentioned earlier, which are Mexican women and some Mexican men as well, who have been deported from the United States after living there for long periods of time. So that's one thing we see that's really common. These are often people who've been in the U.S. for 10, 15, 20 years. And many people ask, why don't they have immigration status? Because there really hasn't been any kind of immigration reform since the mid-'80s, right? There's been some little laws here and there, like the U visa and VAWA provisions, but basically it's very difficult to obtain legal status if you don't have the right family member that can help you obtain that status, and if you aren't basically subject to these certain bars, which is something we can talk about later. It stops a lot of people from getting immigration status, but that's one thing.
And there's a huge backlog too, isn't there, in terms of the courts just being jammed up on it?
Absolutely. There's several countries that have a many long-year wait, and I'm just thinking, I haven't looked at the priority dates, they're called, for Mexico recently, but the priority date for if you have a sister or a brother, if you're a U.S. citizen, a sister or brother in Mexico, I think it's more than 20 years. And when you actually look at the way it goes about being put into effect, I think that's more of like a 100-year wait. I mean, it's absolutely insane. So there is that. The commonality, I think the first one would be the amount of time in the U.S. And kind of those incredible ties with the community that these people have.
It's a lifetime.
Yes. Another commonality, I think, is mixed status families. So we have a lot of women who will have maybe a child that was born in Mexico and they went with them to the United States when they were very small and maybe returned to Mexico when she was deported. And then they have children that are U.S. citizens. So those families are what's called mixed status families. So maybe there's a legal permanent resident there somewhere, there's a U.S. citizen, and there's some undocumented people in there. And again, people will ask ignorantly, well, why haven't those undocumented people been able to obtain their status? Because the laws do not permit it. It's particularly the law of 1996, which is called IRA, which basically came out with these bars that if you're in the U.S. unlawfully for a certain period of time and have to depart the country, you basically trigger this bar, and that can stop you from gaining status or stop you from getting status for a long period of time. So a lot of people have those bars as well. Some of the other commonalities, again, is that unfortunately a lot of the clients that we see have been victims of some kind of violence, often domestic violence or sexual violence, and many of them do qualify or could possibly qualify for a U visa or VAWA. So again, U visa is for people who are the victim of crime within the U.S., and VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, which has a component for people who are married to U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. So those are some of the commonalities. Another one is that people often reach us once they've been in Mexico for several years. So they've already gone through maybe different channels in the U.S., trying to get a hold of an attorney there, maybe going through the U.S. government or the Mexican government, and perhaps have not found the solution that they need, and so they come to Umumi. That's another big one.
Can you give us an example of a specific case?
Sure. I mean, I can give you an example of some of the different factors in a particular case that make the case really difficult and heart-wrenching. Mm-hmm. So, we've seen many cases at the Institute for Women and Migration. I think one would be a mother who had several children in the U.S., so they were all U.S. citizens. She basically was being threatened by her partner that she had to leave the country, or he would call immigration on her, which is actually something that happens quite a bit. It can even happen when the partner is undocumented herself. But this family basically was torn apart by those threats, as she felt she had to leave or she was going to be deported anyway. So she thought she'd come back to Mexico, see if she could set up a life here for her children. Once she was in Mexico, the partner refused to let her have her children back. So that particular case, she hasn't had contact, or she hasn't seen her children in several years, and that's a very common story that we see.
So you end up fighting a long-distance custody battle, which must be extremely difficult.
Yes, that's a whole topic that before coming to Umumi, I worked in California with U visa and VAWA cases, and so this was something that wasn't even on my radar. But it is very common that, again, like I mentioned earlier, people will get deported to the U.S. or sometimes voluntarily return. Maybe they want to start their life here. Maybe there's maybe there's different factors that come into play. But they basically get to Mexico, and they have to basically navigate the U.S. Civil family court system in whatever state their children are in by themselves. So something we're always looking for at Umumi is attorneys, U.S. attorneys, because we have a U.S. immigration attorney here in Mexico, but we do not have a family court, particularly because the person would have to be in the U.S. and they'd have to be in that particular state. They would have to be aware of the laws and policies of that state and that county, and they would basically have to be physically present in whatever state that person was from and help them navigate from Mexico. It's a very difficult task.
Pretty low success rate?
Well, I mean, we even have trouble finding an attorney in the U.S. who will do the case pro bono or for a very low fee. And it also, immigration to the U.S. in terms of Mexico, there was a time when it came from the central kind of western part of the country and it went to certain states, right? Like California, Texas, places like that. It's really diversified. I mean, there are Mexican immigrants all over the United States. Yeah. So we have clients from Mississippi or from North Carolina or from Connecticut. It could be from anywhere, and we have to find an attorney, particularly in that state. And it's a very specific thing, but it's very important to that person's future and their children's future. Yeah.
It seems like family reunification, which normally is a criteria for migration, has been completely removed from the reasons that someone would be allowed to migrate.
Sure.
Or to have asylum in the country.
Yeah.
What does that do to children?
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking at the family separation that's happening right now at the border, we've seen it in a really specific way. You know, being detained, being without your family. I mean, speaking to psychologists, I've spoken to psychologists a lot in the U visa and VAWA cases that I've worked on. It's an incredibly traumatic experience. I mean, like you mentioned earlier, just being taken away from your family or not being with your family for a small period of time can be traumatic, or can cause a lot of sadness. I can't even imagine what these children who are being detained, almost like animals, are suffering right now. But I think it's important to point out what these families that have been separated for years as well are going through, because you have situations that we've definitely seen at IMUMI where people, their children don't want to, like, let's say the mother's in Mexico and the father's in the U.S. They've been with the father for a certain period of time. Maybe the contact has been there, but it's only been by phone and it's been sporadic. I mean, there's often children who turn against the mother, think the mother has abandoned them, when actually they legally cannot return to the United States. I mean, that is a really amazing issue that a lot of family court judges in the U.S. don't even understand. It seems that a lot of family court judges in the U.S. don't know immigration law, even though they're attorneys and they're judges. Unfortunately, they're not aware of the fact that the mother lawfully cannot return to the U.S. under any circumstance.
So they're accusing the mother too sometimes of abandoning the children.
Yep. There's even been children who've been given up in adoption because there wasn't the right communication there, because the mother didn't know where the child was. The mother didn't know to speak to the social worker, perhaps. So there have been those cases, and that is just absolutely heart-wrenching.
Yeah, they're talking about that now, that some children have been put into foster care.
Right.
Because they've taken their families away from them.
Yes.
And we know how traumatic foster care is.
Yes,
absolutely. You talked about grassroots organization and some advantages to having the issue out in the open now, an issue that's been going on that you've been working with, and the Institute's been working on for years. What else is being done? Do you find that there's a greater construction of like cross-border solidarity? You talked about looking for lawyers in the United States. What's happening there? Are we seeing any advances?
Yeah, there actually, IMUMI has the Institute for Women and Migration has a particular example of that, that's happening with some great some great judges in Arizona. So there's actually a task force that was put together that basically has judges in the state of Arizona. It also has civil society organizations. I believe it's called the Southern Arizona Task Force. And what it basically, what we tried to do, we did a webinar in January of this year. And it was basically trying to get those judges on the page of, okay, when someone is deported, what can you do to facilitate that child does not, that the parent does not lose custody of that child? So what are some of the issues to do with immigration law and to do with deportation, and what are those parents' rights to come back or not to the United States? So those kind of relationships we would like to replicate throughout the country. I do work in the area of transnational families, so that is something that we're trying to work on, and we're also trying to work on these kind of cases with the Mexican government, and the way the Mexican government works in the United States through its consulates, again, to try to facilitate that these separations don't happen in the first place. We don't give legal advice in specific cases because we don't have a family law attorney here in Mexico, but we do have a list of kind of recommendations that you can do before you leave the United States. When this could possibly happen, you might be separated from your children. We're trying to work across borders, and I think it's something that with this family separation policy by the Trump administration, I think it's accelerating and speeding up the collaboration.
If you work in popular education among migrant families, what happens if you get deported or you're returning, you get separated? Right. How do you reach them? There's been also this movement kind of back into the shadows because of these policies.
That's a great question. A lot of people in the United States who have come from Mexico don't trust the Mexican government. I think that's something that's something I saw on a personal level and with my clients. I mean, the U.S. consulates do really good work in a lot of areas. However, sometimes there still is that mistrust.
The Mexican consulates in the U.S.
The Mexican consulates in the U.S., right. So, I mean, we do work with the foreign ministry to try to kind of get that information to clients, to the people who do go to the consulate, because there are all sorts of important kind of processes that need to be done. There's issues of dual nationality for children who come back to Mexico, where the family separation doesn't occur, thankfully, and the child can come back to Mexico with the parent. There's a lot of great work being done on that level with the Mexican government, but I think that there's much more to be done.
And birth certificates. And
yes, all those things which seem extremely boring but are incredibly important when the child, basically the child is a U.S. citizen and comes back to Mexico and can't get access to their basic rights as a Mexican citizen because they don't have their nationality registered with the Mexican government. So the Mexican government in the United States, through its consulates, does do a lot of really good work around these issues. But I think that we can always expand. And then there is this issue of people often get their information from other outlets, not from the government, right? From radio. I mean, Spanish language radio is huge in the United States, and so. IMUMI itself is not, we're located in Mexico City. That's not something, unfortunately, within our power to do. But I know that there are a lot of campaigns out there on Spanish language radio that are trying to get this information about how you can prepare for a possible deportation. And I think that's really the only way. It can't only be through a governmental channel. It has to be through many different channels. Yeah.
Through the grapevine, even.
Yes, word of mouth.
One neighbor telling another.
Yep, absolutely.
That kind of thing. Speaking of that, there's been a lot of criticism, speaking of the Mexican government role, there's been a lot of criticism that as these immigration policies in the United States under the Trump presidency got more and more aggressive against both Mexicans and Central Americans that are coming up through Mexico, the defense of migrant rights on the part of the Mexican government, the federal government especially, Peña Nieto, was weak. And that's one of the things that the incoming government has made a point of, with Andrés Manuel López Obrador saying, we're not going to do the U.S.'s dirty work anymore, and we're going to take a more active stance in defending migrants' rights. Do you think there's a possibility for any changes? Do you see any indications of change there?
I do. I think there's definitely indications of change. I mean, I think if you look at López Obrador's plans in terms of migration and immigration in the region, there's a lot of emphasis put on creating development so people don't have to. People aren't forced to migrate. They can migrate because they want to and not because they're forced to. I think that's important. However, he still highlights the importance that this isn't going to be resolved. Migration really isn't something that needs to be resolved. It's a part of human history. It's a part of human nature, right?
People forget that.
Yes, absolutely. People in the U.S. often forget that. That's one of my greatest things that makes me angry. But I think it's important that looks like his administration is going to highlight that, yes, development is important in the region so people aren't forced to migrate. However, this isn't something that's going to be resolved immediately. And people also have a right of movement and have a right to migrate, especially if, in all sorts of different circumstances, economic reasons. You also see a lot of forced migration in the Northern Triangle right now. People are actually, fleeing for their lives. So I think there are good
rise in asylum cases for violence, whereas we used to see more like hunger and poverty.
Right. The cases coming out of El Salvador and Honduras and somewhat Guatemala as well. That is what you're seeing is a huge upticks in the violence that's occurring there. So I think there are good indications that things could change. Something that we are concerned about, I think, at the Institute for Women and Migration is talk of a third safe country agreement.
Tell us briefly what that is, because many people might not know.
Absolutely. So a third safe country agreement basically says that the country you first go through when fleeing your country of origin, the first safe country you get to, you have to ask for asylum basically in that country. And so the idea would be that Mexico would serve as the first safe country for people fleeing, particularly from the Northern Triangle, from Central America. And, you know, people are very against this, including the Institute for Women and Migration, including advocates and immigration attorneys. And there are lots of different reasons. The U.S. has an international and national, basically, our national law and international law prohibits that. And we have an absolute obligation to take in asylum seekers.
Prohibits forcing people to ask for asylum in another country before arriving to the United States.
It prohibits, I mean, it basically obligates us to take in and give a credible fear interview people who have a credible fear of returning to their country of origin. So it would be basically making Mexico do the work that the U.S. should be doing. And then another thing is that you know, Mexico has definitely strengthened its asylum laws fairly recently, but there is still a huge backlog of cases. And I think that, you know, our position is that Mexico needs to strengthen even more the protections for asylum seekers before it can be considered a safe third country. At this point, that's not something, that's not the point Mexico is at. And again, Mexico should not serve as a filter for the U.S. And people also should have the right, if they deem the U.S. as the safest place for them to go, in their particular situation, they should have the right to ask asylum where they wish to ask for asylum. So.
And then there's the question of family reunification.
Yes.
So many of them have their relatives, the other part of their family, even immediate family,
Yep.
in the United States,
Absolutely.
which comes back to that central core principle.
Yes.
That's been lost in all this, tragically, especially for the children.
It has. I mean, family reunification has supposedly been a main guiding point in U.S. immigration law, and I say supposedly because it doesn't always come out to fruition. But since, I believe, 1965 or so, the law was changed, so it was basically based on family reunification and then some employment. There's all sorts of immigration law, but it's basically family reunification and employment-based immigration law. So yes, I mean, that should be the guiding principle. However, how it actually happens in real life is often not the case, unfortunately.
Well, Molly Goss, thank you so much for your important work with the Institute for Women in Migration, and thank you for joining us here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.